Good afternoon, and welcome to Ask Her. I'm Jackie Lendsey, Interim President and CEO of the Washington Area Women's Foundation. We are a community-supported foundation that invests in the power of women and girls of color in the Washington, D.C. region. We award grants and advocate alongside our partners toward gender and racial justice. Ask Her is the Women's Foundation's interview series with women leaders, our partners, community members, and supporters who work tirelessly for women, girls, and gender-expansive people of color. If you hear anything good, be sure to tweet during our chat using @AskHerSeries at Ask Her Series, and you can follow us at the Women's Foundation, and that's at TheWomenFNDT. A lot to remember, but hopefully you will chat, and hopefully you will follow us at the Women's Foundation. We'd like to welcome everyone who's joining us today, including Ebony Gayton, our American Sign Language interpreter, and Stephanie Chow, who we've brought on as another sign language interpreter who will be joining us later during the chat. So if you notice a person coming in late, that's Stephanie Chow, our other interpreter. We're thrilled to have an especially timely conversation during this Native American Heritage Month. Our special guest today is Shannon O'Loughlin, Chief Executive and Attorney for the Association on American Indian Affairs. Let me tell you a little bit about Shannon because she's quite the woman. She is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and Chief Executive and Attorney, as I said, for the Association on American Indian Affairs, the longest serving nonprofit in Indian country since 1922. Shannon has been practicing law for more than 20 years and is a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. I told you she was something. She's the former chief of staff to the National Indian Gaming Commission, where she assisted in the development and implementation of national policy throughout the agency and oversaw the agency's public affairs, technology, compliance, and finance divisions. Shannon has also served Indian country in the private sector as an attorney, leading a large national firm's Indian law practice group that worked to strengthen, maintain, and protect Indian nation sovereignty, self-determination, and culture. Shannon received a BA in American Indian Studies from California State University, Long Beach, and joint MD, MA, and JD degrees from the University of Arizona in Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy. She resides in the homelands of the Piscataway peoples with her husband and son. Please join me in welcoming Shannon O'Loughlin to today's Ask Her series.
Thank you so much, Jackie. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me to join this wonderful organization's chat today.
We couldn't think of a better person as we talk about Native American Heritage Month, but it's not the month, it's Native American heritage and the issues throughout the year and over time. So let me start with this. Shannon, there are 574 recognized Native nations in the United States and more than 300 other groups and brands, and each one of them are diverse. Can we start by defining the difference in the terms American Indian, Native American, and Indigenous people? And then what's your preference?
Yes, that's always an important question because people want to be sensitive to having a productive conversation. And oftentimes we find that people are uncomfortable with addressing Native American issues because they're not sure about the terms to use. I think an important place to start to understand what term is appropriate is understanding that Native nations are political entities. So Native peoples are not just about race. This is not just a race issue or an ethnicity issue. These are issues that involve political, sovereign nation governments who have their own court systems, their own legislatures, their own executive, and ways in which they carry out governmental functions. And they're separate sovereigns. So those 574 federally recognized tribes are all diverse and are throughout the United States. Those 300 other groups, there are so many non-recognized nations in the East, like the Piscataway peoples here in Maryland. And the terms that we see used in Indian country, of course, that term Indian is a legal term of art. It is a defined legal term that refers to not a race of people under the law, but that political relationship between the US federal government and who is an Indian and who is an Indian tribe. So many people are offended by the term Indian because it's a mischaracterization of who we are, but it is a legally defined term. Many Native Americans prefer the term Native American, prefer the term Native or indigenous, but I think you would be correct in getting to know Native people that we definitely prefer that you refer to our own Native nations that we belong to. So for example, I'm a Choctaw woman, Choctaw, Polish and Irish woman, and I prefer that as a proper term to refer to me.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're from, your upbringing, and what led you finally to the Association on American Indian Affairs?
Oh yeah, I grew up in the backwoods of southeastern Oklahoma. So the Choctaw people are originally from the southeastern United States and were removed to Indian territory in the 1830s by President Andrew Jackson. It was the Choctaw Nation and other nations in the Southeast that traveled what is now known as the Trail of Tears over the Mississippi River and into Indian Territory. The Choctaw people, their land that was guaranteed to them by treaty is the southeastern part of Oklahoma. So I came from there. And most of my family I know come from there. And what's interesting is in the place that I grew up is that, and with all due respect, the white people lived in town. The Black people lived across the railroad tracks, and the Indians were in the woods beyond that. So that's how many of the towns back where I grew up were how they were situated. No one in my family had a high school diploma. So it was a big deal when I got a high school diploma in my family. I grew up with a grandmother who's full-blood Choctaw woman who would tell me stories about the violence that was perpetrated against her and her family as she grew up in southeastern Oklahoma. And she would tell these long and really horrible stories and then look me in the eye and say, I went through all of this so that you could be here, so that you can go to school and come back and help your people. So that's what I did. I had no clue what that meant. All I knew was that I needed to go to school, and it took me 11 years to get an undergraduate degree as I worked to put myself through school, but was able to get a scholarship for my master's and my law degree at the University of Arizona. And I knew no lawyers. I didn't know what that was going to mean. all I knew is that when I read those federal Indian law cases, it really touched a nerve or set a fire loose in me. So if you're not aware, federal Indian law is a separate body of law. It's different than other common law. And it's developed out of different principles. It's developed out of principles of what some call the government to government political relationship between the federal government and the US. At the same time, it's based on this idea of a guardian-ward relationship. So the United States and justices of the US Supreme Court held back in the 1800s that Indians were sovereign. They had sovereignty, but at the same time were incapable. They were savages, unable to take care of themselves. So the federal government was the patriarch, was the guardian, and the Indians were its wards. And so it sets this kind of really racist precedent that is carried through even until today in all of our federal law, that keeps Native people from truly being self-determining. And it was through reading these cases and, reading through them and seeing that, wow, this is an issue. It really looks like the Indians are going to win here. And then this really strange logic that can be labeled nothing but racism changed the perspective of how the court was going, and the Indians always lost. And it really wanted me to find a way to do better in Indian country and do what my grandma asked me to.
Can you tell us a little bit? Thank you. That's certainly more information than we usually get in terms of not only the explanation, but also talking about the whole way in which the law has formed what has happened to Native American people, to the various tribes, and certainly how racism has played a role in all of that. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that's done at the Association of American Indian Affairs and your work?
Sure. So the association has been around almost 100 years. We'll be celebrating our 100-year anniversary next year, which is just incredible. And the organization really came about at a time in the early 1900s when the policies of the day that the federal government perpetuated were assimilation, were removal of lands from Native communal ownership, were kidnapping children and sending them to boarding schools, outlawing language and culture, holding back rations and food if you were to practice your religion or culture, digging up graves, stealing cultural and sacred and religious items, and creating a scientific museum and commercial market for those items, really dispossessing Native peoples of everything that made them who they were as culturally diverse and vibrant peoples, and making them dependent on the US government for food and protection. So the Association on American Indian Affairs started in 1922. The first case that we worked on were protecting Pueblo lands in the Southwest from theft. The Pueblos in New Mexico and in Arizona were given lands by treaty, or were reserved lands by treaty. So remember that Indians weren't given anything. These were lands that belonged to Native peoples. And so these treaties reserved lands for Native peoples and allowed other people to come in around those reservations or those land areas. So in the Southwest, Spain had entered into treaties with Pueblo nations, and the United States and the states were working to get access to those Pueblo lands and trying to take them away from Pueblo people. So the association worked with on the ground with those governors of those Pueblos to help protect those land rights, those rights to sacred places in those areas. And from then on, it was about language, protecting land, and really advocating, lobbying the federal government, helping to develop new laws that changed the direction of federal Indian policy that was bent towards assimilation and genocide, and pushed them towards self-determination and sovereignty. And so you see the association being involved in major watershed cases and legislation from then until now. Today, our laws better represent that self-determination and sovereignty, but it took many decades to get us there. Today, we are focused on those issues that have to do with our cultural sovereignty, the things that make us who we are as Native peoples, our language, our cultures, our religion, and our ceremonial practices, our youth and our elders, those that give us life and those that carry us through life. So the association really has a broad and national reach, but we do everything from a grassroots standpoint. So we rely on tribes and our work with tribes to feed what it is we're doing nationally.
A broad agenda.
Yes, extremely
A broad agenda.
There's a lot of work to do.
So there's so much that we could talk about, but this is a timely moment when it comes to not only what you may be focusing on, but the Washington Area Women's Foundation is doing grant making to local organizations providing culturally specific support to individuals especially impacted by violence. And in particular, we're talking about women, girls, and when it comes, and two-spirit individuals when it comes to those who are especially impacted by this violence. We're seeing an alarming number of statistics when it comes to Native American women and girls. For example, according to the White House, almost 1,500 American Indian and Native American missing persons have been recorded across the United States by the National Criminal Information Center, and 2,700 homicide cases have been reported to the federal government's Uniform Crime Reporting Program. Again, this is a timely issue, both for Native Americans and for African Americans, considering the attention that was paid more recently to a young white woman who went missing, and just the notion and the notice that other communities brought to bear on the same kind of attention being brought to bear on these numbers that I've just mentioned. So there's a crisis of missing and murdered Native Americans, and the Justice Department has reported that on some reservations, Native American women are murdered at a rate more than 10 times the national average. Why do you think that is?
Well, and it goes back to history, right? This isn't just happening in a vacuum right now in this place, but it's an environment that's been created through federal Indian law and policy. Through assimilation and through dispossessing Native peoples of everything that makes them healthy and whole, and perpetuating this guardian-ward relationship. So let's talk about this violence, because it's not just murder. We're talking about, domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, homicide, stalking, sex trafficking. It's disproportionately affecting Indigenous peoples more than any other racial or ethnic group. the issue as to why is it's been made easy to abuse our people. It's been made easy to abuse our people because remember those kind of racist court cases I was talking about? There was one court case in the Supreme Court called Oliphant. It's referred to as Oliphant versus Suquamish. And this was a legal case in which a non-native person was on the Suquamish Indian reservation and committed assault against a tribal police officer. And of course, the tribe arrested this individual and put him in jail. And this non-Indian individual fought the case, went to federal court, and claimed that Indians didn't have any right to assert any kind of criminal law against him on the reservation, even though the crimes he was committing was within tribal territory. And the United States Supreme Court held, by referring to those past precedents that were based on tribes being inferior, tribes not being capable to have their own governments equal to US governments or courts, cited to those precedents to hold that tribes were not capable of asserting criminal jurisdiction over a white or non-Indian individual. And so that removed tribal nations' ability to assert jurisdiction over criminal acts happening against Indian people by non-Indian people. So that means tribal nations, again, are dependent on the federal or state and local entities to prosecute crimes that happen in Indian country. And because of this historical and intergenerational racism that happens in rural and local communities, the prosecution that's needed here is not happening. The connections and networking and resources that are needed has not and is not happening. So the fact that attention is finally being placed on these issues and resources are starting to come to tribes is extremely heart-lifting. But so far it hasn't changed the numbers yet. This is still crisis. And there are a lot of things that tribes are doing to try to protect their women. And it's about keeping your eyes on your community. I've heard stories of getting all the big Indian men together to keep an eye out on women, to keep an eye out on in casinos and other economic development operations, warehousing, gas pipeline, and keeping an eye out on who is there and how they're interacting with women and other indigenous peoples to help protect them. So it's about civil engagement oftentimes on tribal nation territories.
It's interesting, before I ask you a little bit about some of the things that are going on nationally and some of the work that President Biden is doing in this area, it is interesting. You talked about the sovereignty of Indian nations, and you talked about court and law enforcement. Is there an issue around reporting and all of these basic court and law enforcement entities coming together and trying to do more work to either find or deal with these domestic cases? I've heard that there is a challenge there.
Yeah, there really is a challenge, especially with opening up. And this happens in many places where tribes desperately need state and federal information. But because of that lack of equity among tribal nation governments and their law enforcement and courts with federal and state governments, there's not that I would have to say a good word, maybe cross-deputization of police officers and equal resource availability, that tribes don't have access to that information and therefore can't, they don't have any notification if a criminal is within their territory. So that is a really large issue of tribes not having access to pertinent information that involves protecting their people in their territory.
You know, again, this conversation is timely. President Biden just signed on Monday an executive order directing federal agencies, including the Departments of Justice, Interior, and Homeland Security, to create a strategy addressing what the president called a crisis of violence against Native Americans. Safety is a priority for our work at the Women's Foundation, and it was quite devastating to see the horrific trends sustaining what's happening to Native Americans. And most alarming is the reality that 84.3% of American Indian and Alaskan Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. What initiatives are you working on at the association in regard to these issues?
And most of the difficult work is happening on the ground in those nations, in those communities, keeping eyes peeled for dangerous activity that's happening, and doing things that educate Native American citizens and those living in those environments, which are particularly bad near pipeline and other man camps. They're called man camps, where men come in to build temporarily either pipelines or gas and oil drilling. And so it's about being on the ground and protecting people through civil engagement. The association does its best as a national organization to make sure everyone is educated about what's happening on the ground, and to make sure that resources get to where they need to go, that advocacy is being done here in DC and other places in order to get resources to the ground, and to make sure people are aware of the issues. It's amazing to me that we live in a country that still doesn't recognize that Native nations even exist as part of our society and an important part of our society and culture here in America. And so sometimes these issues, we're constantly educating about these issues over and over again, because there's such a hole, such a lack of knowledge and public education about Native American Indians in general.
You know, what can we do? What can the rest of us do to support national and local initiatives that help combat this crisis? What can we do?
Right. And so, violence against Indigenous peoples is a symptom of historic and intergenerational racism that continues today. And the first thing that we can do to combat it is educate ourselves. What we often like to direct people to is there are some great websites and resources that help educate people about Native people in the area that they're at. So there are websites where you can go in and type your location to learn about the people on whose land you're standing on today. And I'll share that in the chat in a minute. I'll share that website. And Native nations still today pray for those homelands, pray for those places and sacred places that they've had to leave behind. And so I think recognizing that the place where we're at was once taken care of by Indigenous peoples, who were forcibly removed from their home, and that we have a responsibility standing on this land today to make sure that things don't continue down the same path. I think it's important for all of us to recognize that Native peoples are contemporary people. Often in our public education system, education about tribal nations stops at about 1900 or 1920. And so we are constantly being stereotyped and recognized as people who are long gone, and our cultures are long gone and past. Even if you go into many museums, you'll see a sacred object or even a funerary object, a burial belonging behind glass with a little label, and that's all you get. I definitely encourage everyone to visit the National Museum of the American Indian. It has wonderful and appropriate exhibits about contemporary Native people. And they've got some great food there as well, indigenous foods that you can try. But it's important to remember that indigenous people are people that you pass going to the grocery store. They are with you in your community. The Washington, D.C. area has many people from different tribes. During the 1940s and 50s, there was a federal policy called relocation, which attempted to pull people off the reservation and send them to cities to get jobs. The federal government did that in order to remove the responsibility for tribes in community on communally held lands, and to decrease that responsibility and to assimilate tribal people into the cities. And of course, what happened is that those jobs weren't there after those families moved. But many of those relocated families are still here today in the Washington, D.C. area, and many more come here to work in government. And there are so many wonderful indigenous peoples in this administration, like Deb Haaland, who is the first Native American who was appointed to Biden's cabinet in the Department of the Interior. The National Park Service head is a Native American. And there are so many other Native people who are in important positions in our government today, which is really historic and amazing. Finally, we're in places so that we can support those policies that affect our lives back home. Other things that we can do, of course, besides, changing public education and our own understanding, is that we can volunteer for Native organizations. There are several around the Washington, D.C. area, along with the Association on American Indian Affairs. And of course, there's other local and regional nonprofits that are working on the ground across the country on issues of domestic violence. I think a good Google search will bring up many indigenous-led organizations. And I want to stress that if you're looking to support Native American organizations and community efforts, that you look for indigenous-led organizations or organizations that have a full Native American board as part of their structure. There are still organizations out there that are not indigenous-led and who do not have the support of Native America in Indian country. And so it's always good to support those that are indigenous-led.
I want to also say, note that there are some good resources that are also on your website that people can go to find out more information about what's happening with Native American women and girls and what locally may be happening on reservations and so on Native American land. So if you want to put some of that in the chat, that'd be helpful, or just put the your organization's website in the chat. I have so many questions I want to ask, but I want to get to a couple that are really important here. And one of them is, through your work, you're attempting to demolish racial hierarchies altogether. And considering that the Black Lives Matters movement picked up steam last year, and increased gender-based violence also picked up steam at the same time, and the continued disappearance of Black and Indigenous women, what challenges has your organization faced during the pandemic? How has the pandemic impacted your work?
Both good and bad, actually, to be honest. Positively, it forced us to close our office. So we're a completely virtual organization. And what that has done positively for us is it's allowed us to hire and recruit some incredible folks from around Indian country, because they don't have to move and relocate to the DC area where it's expensive to live. So we've developed some strong virtual assets, and we've become more of a virtual community at the association. So that's been a positive change, and we're really growing into having that technological expertise and prowess in delivering our messages and the work that we do in Indian country. So we're able to reach out to so many more tribes virtually as tribes are getting more attention and getting better internet quality and broadband. We are just finishing up our 7th annual repatriation conference, which is a conference about returning and repatriating Native American human remains, burial items, cultural and sacred objects back from museums, from federal agencies, from private collectors, from international institutions, from auction houses, back to tribes. And we've had more than 700 people register for our conference, and we would not have been able to do that if we were an in-person conference. So more people can have access virtually. And I think having that access and getting training and technical assistance out quickly and efficiently has really helped the organization do what it does best, and to better educate. What hasn't been so great about the pandemic is how many people in our communities and our nations that we've lost because of the pandemic. So that base level has been extremely difficult to manage as we are suffering so much loss in our Native nations and so much illness. It's on the other hand, it's made us look more deeply about health in our communities and the healthcare system. It's also, the pandemic has given us more work, and we're still the same number of people with the same number of hours in the day. So because there's so much attention on these anti-racist movements and gender and LGBTQ two-spirit movements, there's also more people asking questions and wanting to be educated about these issues. And so we're still, a small and lean organization, and we lack some of the capacity we really need to deliver the tools and technical assistance and training that we could really do with more hands.
There are just so many questions and so many things we want to hear from you. And at the same time, we have people who've joined us for this conversation, and they have some questions. But I want to end just a formal portion of asking questions about something you talked about in terms of the 574 tribes around the country and the 300 other groups. And you mentioned the Piscataway people. And I'd ask if you could, as a native Washingtonian, who's someone who's lived here all my life, I know a little bit about the Piscataway people and especially in their history in Maryland. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that community that's right here on the East Coast, but very specifically has been a large part of what is now Maryland and the District of Columbia.
That's right. So the Piscataways people were a confederacy of tribes. So today, for me to just say the Piscataway peoples is really not giving much justice to the many bands and families who are still around today, who are separate and distinct, and were once part of a greater confederacy that were a part of this area that called this area home. And we're talking about from Potomac River, from Virginia on up past Baltimore and over. And I don't want to forget to mention that in Virginia over the last, I think, 5-6 years, 7 tribes were federally recognized in Virginia. And before that, there had been no federally recognized tribes in Virginia. The Piscataway and the different bands and peoples that exist in Maryland there is, I believe, a couple of state recognized bands here in Maryland, but none federally recognized. And what that means is that those nations that are federally recognized have a formal political relationship with the United States government based on treaty making and other agreements throughout time. Whereas state recognized tribes may choose not to go through a federal acknowledgement process. And many try to unsuccessfully because of the difficulties in that process. So, but the Piscataway people are still here, they're still energetic, and they're doing wonderful things across our homes.
Now, I've got another question for you, but I'll ask it after we give some of the participants on the call the opportunity to ask some questions. So Mercy, are there some good questions out there for Shannon?
Absolutely. So we have a question here from Martine. Shannon, thank you for sharing your personal story in this conversation. When it comes to the legal relationships between reservations and the federal government, and as applicable states, what would you and or the association like to see change for the betterment of tribes going forward?
That's a big, complicated question, but one I'd love to dig into a little bit. There are, it's so convoluted, the federal government's relationship with various tribes. And just to be clear, each one of those 574 federally recognized tribes, they're each diverse, and each of them, because of their history, there may be different laws that apply to each one of those tribes. And on top of that, the state relationship with those tribes makes that tribe's sovereignty unique as compared to the 573 other federally recognized tribes. Another thing that becomes convoluted is the funding that goes to tribal nations. Many believe that funding is some kind of special group funding, or some other part of some line item, government giving away social services funding, but that's not the case. The funding that goes to tribes is based on that government to government relationship. That trade for land and resources is the consideration for the funding from Congress and the government. So these aren't special services, but these are promises in a contract of what tribes are supposed to be provided for giving up their land and other resources. What could be better? What we would hope in the future is that we grow a better process for delivering those funds to tribes in a way that allows tribes to have self-determination over how they spend the money. So oftentimes tribes have to go through competitive processes or fulfill the government's requirement of what the government thinks the tribe should spend that funding on. For example, juvenile detention centers. Many tribes have alternative forms of recompense, of correcting bad behavior, especially with youth. And oftentimes the only way they can get support and funding is through having infrastructure built that can only be used for juvenile detention and not for any kind of restorative recovery type programs. So if the federal government or the Bureau of Indian Affairs could provide funding that wasn't so restrictive, so tribes could use that funding to build the type of infrastructure they need as they decide for their people, I think that would be a huge step forward than how the US government currently funds many programs that occur in Indian country. And that's a subject I could go on and on about, because oftentimes federal government programs, they may last 2 or 3 years and then the funding is gone. So there's no sustainability often in what the government will provide for tribes. Oh, let's do it this way for 2 or 3 years and then you won't have it anymore. It's just not a way of doing business and really helping tribes develop the self-sustainability that they need with that support. Is that too much?
No. We've got lots of questions. That wasn't too much.
That was great.
That was
Yes,
great.
more questions, but first a comment from Nitsa. I'm angry that our sisters' lives of the original Pueblos are historically violated and subjected to all sorts of exclusion and disposed of their lands and their whole self. My sorority and solidarity with you and all women of ancestral communities. Thank you so much, Nitsa. And then we have 2 questions here, or a few questions from Lori. What was the name of the Supreme Court case that you cited? I think that was at the beginning of the conversation.
It was Oliphant versus Suquamish tribe. So Oliphant, Olipphant versus Suquamish, Suquamish.
We
You
are
should be
impressed
able
with your spelling. Thank you.
I am too.
And then a follow-up question from Lori. What role might the press play in raising these issues? Do you know of reporters in Colorado or Arizona whose beat is Native peoples?
Actually, I think AZ Central has a good couple of reporters there that often contact us that we have a good relationship with. Journalism is and appropriate journalism is so important to these issues. And there's actually a Native American Journalists Association, and they put out some wonderful information to help educate non-Native and other people who wish to write stories about Indian country and the issues going on there. So there are some wonderful journalists out there. There's also some Native American online and paper magazines and news. I think of Native News Online. I think of Indian Country Today, those are the top 2 news sources. There's also a great online news source called Indians with a Z.com. Where you can find Native American specific news.
There's also your own Red Hoop Talk.
So the association, actually during the pandemic, what happened, I'll try to give the short story, is I was invited to be a part of a Joe Rogan Experience show, which I thought was just a horrible experience personally for me. But what that did was kind of set wheels turning into, like, again, as it always does, why don't we just do our own show? And the purpose of Red Hoop Talk, which is a Native news and talk show, was to showcase individual Native Americans who are working in Indian country to make life better for us. And so what we're hearing in these wonderful video podcasts, some, as short as 45 minutes, some go past 3 hours. And we have it on our website, but it's also on YouTube, and we do it through Facebook Live and Twitter as well. Is this story of staying close to culture, staying close to identity and community, and resilience. It's about, many of us have gone through, whether it's addiction or dependency issues or other problems in our lives, and come out the other side, and what that looks like, and how we've used those experiences to change the lives of others. So they're really empowering stories, and we often get into the meat of legal issues. We've recently did a show about fashion. We did a show about food sovereignty, and this Friday we're doing a live show about repatriation, and we have 2 guests on who are both Alaska Native, to give us their perspective on their stories and the work they do, returning ancestors and Native cultural items.
Do we have time for one last question, Mercy?
We have time for 2 if you don't mind.
Go right ahead.
So another question we touched on briefly is, what are the specific issues facing Native people and families in urban areas such as DC?
Oh yeah. So it was hard to get the vaccine. So there's a center in Baltimore that many folks work to try to get the vaccine for Native peoples and get that accessible, because our communities have many health problems which can cause complications if we contract the coronavirus. But if I remember your question correctly, healthcare, of course, is an issue. And what is our issues here in the area? We are so lucky in this urban environment in DC, because there are so many Native peoples who come here to work, and many who have lived over several decades. And there's really a great support network of those individuals, because we're all here working for the betterment of our homes back home. And there's also some wonderful internships and fellowships, and so many of our youth come in through DC to learn more about advocacy and how they can work in Indian country. So in the DC area, I think we're really, really lucky as an urban community. I think other urban areas, as any, suffer from invisibility and not having the resources needed, like healthcare and other support to be successful in those environments.
Thank you very much for that answer. And we have one last question. What role can art play in raising awareness and motivating action about violence against Native women? For example, I just became aware of the issue after watching the film Wind River.
Oh, and there is some great work being done by contemporary artists as well as actors, screenwriters, and such. I hope everyone has been aware of on Peacock, Rutherford Falls, which has Native American writers and actors. And what is so great about this show is it's a comedy, but throughout the 30 minutes of comedy, you're being educated and you don't know it. There's also other amazing work out there by Sterling Harjo called Reservation Dogs. This is on Hulu. It's just ended its first season, and it's about a community of Muskogee Nation in Oklahoma. There's some movies coming out, and I'm forgetting the name, but there's a lot of work being done in Indian country to uplift Native Americans in the film and TV industry. There's some great books out there. A current author, her name's Angeline Booley, just wrote and has been winning awards for a book called Firekeeper's Daughter, which is listed as a juvenile or a youth book. But I will tell you, it is nothing. Every adult should read this book. And again, it tells a beautiful story, and it's educating you throughout the story, and you don't even know that's what's happening. There are wonderful contemporary Native American artists out there, and many come out of the school, the Institute for American Indian Arts in New Mexico. So if you want to look up IAIA.org, I think is the website. There's also First Peoples Fund, which helps deliver grant and other funding to artists in many different modalities of art and music. There's some great musicians out there. So I hope you'll Google and look around YouTube and other places for some amazing Indigenous peoples that are out there creating new messages and new stories that are meant to share. If you go to your local museum or your university museum and see our sacred items and our burial belongings behind glass with a label, well, go to your university and tell them you're not going to give them any more money. Tell them that they need to repatriate those items back and focus instead on the contemporary relationship between Native Americans and the rest of our American society.
Well, Shannon, we could spend another 2, 3, 4 hours with you. This has been such an insightful conversation. The questions were very good, just really on point. And we're just really grateful because we know how busy you are, that you've had the time to spend with us today and to join us. And as we join you in the work of safety and women and girls in this country, and definitely the safety of women and girls in Native country. I want everyone to stay in touch with the Women's Foundation and visit our website, thewomensfoundation.org, if you've enjoyed our conversation today. I want you to join us for our next at Ask Her interview on December 9th with Leah Austin, who is the director, the Center for the Study of Child Care Employment, and Nitsa Sequi, the vice chair of the board of DC's Multicultural Spanish-Speaking Provider Association. We'll discuss the fact that early child care is a justice issue. Shannon, again, thank you so much for joining us. I think there are a couple of people in the chat who, if you don't mind, if you don't have a problem with putting your email address in, they probably have some questions they'd love to ask you. But thank you for being a champion, for protecting, preserving, and for looking at justice when it comes to Native Americans and Native American issues. And I know that people can go to the website of the Association of American Indian Affairs and find out more about the work that you're doing, but thank you so much for your amazing work and for joining the conversation. And thanks to everyone out there who also joined the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thanks. Goodbye.